SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 6. Draco. I don't know why I told her all of that rubbish. I mean, it was true, but why did she need to know that? I knocked the willow curtain out of the way and re-entered the quiet, still, grassy room. I stopped and raked my hands through my hair. I felt rattled, lightheaded, like I was breathing too quickly. I scowled at the pile of books, then kicked it over and sat down, hard by the tilting clock. I rubbed my eyes, my face, then fell down onto my back. I clenched my fist and pounded the ground. They made a dull thud, because the grass was so thick. I gritted my teeth as hard as I could squeeze my eyes shut. Granger was busy studying, experimenting, observing, and fiddling with this magic, using all of her overachieving mind to figure out a way out of this place. She was a bulldog. She wouldn't give it up until she figured this room out. And I, on the other hand, was using all of my power to keep from thinking, to keep from remembering the night of blood all over my hands as my father smiled down at me. I stood up, sucking in deep breaths, and paced away from that spot. No, I wouldn't let this do this to me. I would not allow that blasted room to get in here. I wouldn't let those nightmares weasel their way into my waking thoughts. Granger had seen all of that. All that in my house. All that begging and pleading and groveling. All the twisted dysfunction that made up my family. I knew she had. I could tell by the disgusting, pitying way she looked at me now, and I hadn't been helping the situation. I'd been acting like a baby ever since that incident, arguing about Santa Claus, and fretting about whether or not I was alone in here, and breaking down and sobbing like a 2-year-old, in front of her. I snorted. What was I, a Malfoy or a Weasley? I had to harden myself. It was easily done, if I had time and will enough to do, and I would. I had to. I would be ruined otherwise. The wind rustled. I glanced through a space in the long, thin branches. Odd. Was the sky getting darker? I scowled. I wasn't going out there to find out. Granger could do whatever fool thing she wanted to do, with the nightmares and spooks. Nothing would make me leave this tree. I paced back and forth for 3 hours, the same path over and over. With every step I took, those little gold lights fluttered up out of the grass, and weirdly enough, the grass and little white flowers didn't smash down, even though I often stomped through them and sometimes kicked at them. I muttered hurriedly out loud, reciting the formulas for my upcoming potions exam. Then I ran through the charms I'd learned, or half-learned, this past week. I was practicing my dueling stance and executing such spells as Expelliarmus and Reducto, using that infernal-leaning clock as a target. Without a wand, of course. I did that last exercise over and over, until I was breathing hard and had to stop for a moment. I rested my hands on my hips, trying to conjure up something else to help them level my head. Dark fingers of the memory of my drawing room crept into the back of my mind. "Come now, Draco," said the voice of my conscience, which always sounded vaguely like my father. "You are letting that mudblood work through the magic of this place rather than finding a way out of your own. Get out of this tree. You are stalling, boy. Are you afraid of the dark? You have something important to do, something vital. Now leave this place and—" I dove for one of the books. I no longer cared which. My shaking hands landed on the one called Pride and Prejudice. I thudded down, cross-legged, and pried open the cover. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. I took a deep, steadying breath. Oh, good. Ancient, wordy, flowery rubbish. I was going to have to concentrate. Gritting my teeth and focusing my eyes, I made myself keep reading. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with the critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figures to be light and pleasing, and in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. Of this she was perfectly unaware. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere. and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. "Say something to her, you clod," I muttered into the quiet, rubbing the back of my sore neck. These foppish men and their ridiculous manners. If one of them liked the girl, he ought to ask her to dance. To blazes with what anyone else thought about him. At the beginning of the book I had completely understood the class difference, and how he had at first been repulsed by Elizabeth's lower class. But they were all muggles, so I was confused as to why this Mr. Darcy clown still seemed to be conflicted. If he dallied around for much longer, I was going to throw the book across the room and start reading Sherlock Holmes, whatever that was. The wind whispered. I lifted my head. No, it moaned, rather like it used to wuther around my tower at home. I lowered the book and gazed through the rustling branches of the wall. It was dark outside. I frowned. How long had Granger been lying out there? "Stop it," I said, turning back to the pages. "Doesn't matter." But all of a sudden, I couldn't concentrate on the words. They blurred together. I frowned after a few moments of scanning. How many times had I read that last line? I slammed it shut and tossed it to the side. It spun off into the grass. I swore again, then got up. I paced a while longer, my hands stuffed in my pockets, but I kept stalling, glancing toward the swaying curtain of branches. It looked pitch dark outside. I stopped and leaned toward a gap. I couldn't see anything. My brow tightened, and I reached out and pushed a few of the slithering branches out of the way. I breathed in quiet, unsettled amazement. Outside, thick gray fog obscured the barley. Crouching, damp and heavy, like the eerie mist lurking between the stones of a graveyard on the moor. It chilled my fingers and nose. A cold air filled my lungs as I drew in a breath. It smelled like frost. "Granger?" I called her name before I thought about it, though not very loud. My voice came out hoarse, from disuse. The fog swallowed my sound. I glanced back at the warm stillness of the willow. I gritted my teeth. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't shouting that she'd found the door. In fact, she'd told me to go away and quit bothering her, which I had been happy to do. My leaving this willow and going out into the fog would be harebrained. I'd never find my way back, and for what? So I could go stumbling about in the dark, looking for some nitwit girl who didn't have half the sense God gave a hinky-punk? I scowled, drew my head back in, and slapped the gap shut, letting the willow branches rattle. "Idiot," I growled, pacing back the tree trunk. Lying there out there in the freezing smog and dirt, waiting for the ghouls to come out of the woodwork. Brilliant. Let's give it a try, shall we? I walked 3 times around the perimeter of the willow room before I slowed to a stop again and stared at the place I had peered out. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't shouting that she'd found the door. That's what was troubling me. What was out there? Where had that fog come from? And why did it give me that sick, familiar, cold feeling I remember from the goblin cave? What would it be like to have fallen asleep while that mist snaked through the barley and covered everything in a shroud? I shuddered. Then I flushed so that my cheeks burned. I was standing here pacing the floor like an old housewife, and the Muggleborn was out there, in the midst of black fog and ice, in hopes of understanding even just a shred of this magic. I've seen it for years now, no matter how hard I've tried to drum it out of you. My father's voice rang in my head. You are a coward, a weakling. Hang it all, I snapped, darted forward, and barreled through the willow branches and into the cold, wet fog. Instantly it swallowed me. I spun around, searching for the willow. I couldn't see it. Muttering curses under my breath, I tried to keep my heartbeat from speeding up. I turned back around and headed out into the field. There was nothing for it now. "Blast you, stupid girl," I snarled, my feet crunching on the icy stalks. "I'll not be undone. Not by you, some Muggleborn know-nothing, senseless, arrogant—" I trailed off. I squinted. A dark form lay amidst the grass ahead of me. I frowned. It couldn't be her. It was too still. I stopped my reflexive reach for my wand, bit the inside of my cheek, and crept forward. For all I knew, the room was about to produce a boggart, or a 10-foot python, or a spider the size of a wardrobe. I refused to think of myself as a coward, but cowardice was not the same as caution. The wind no longer moved. The air hung silent. My feet snapped twigs and crushed dry grass as I came around to the side of the dark shape. I slowed. I stopped. Granger lay there on her back, her arms locked to her sides. Her eyes were closed, but they did not move beneath her lids. Her mouth was a hard line. Her skin looked gray, like stone. "Granger," I said again. Nothing happened. I glanced down. Her fist had clenched so hard that each one of her knuckles shone white. The muscles in her jaw clamped, and she frowned hard, but it didn't look like she was breathing. I jerked my head up. My mind whirled as I reached the reaches of my visibility. What was in this mist? A spell? A sleeping? A curse? Poison? I wanted to run. I wanted to pelt back to that willow and the clear air inside, but my feet locked, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from her as she lay there, stiff as a board. She was dead. I knew she was. I could tell just by looking at her. I had seen death before, watching him leave his mark on people's bodies. His signature was here. So why couldn't I run? With everything I had, ever since I could remember, I had burned with an inner fury wrapped in an iron shield, like a well-made furnace, and I would laughingly scald anyone as punishment for getting too close, or just for the enjoyment of causing pain. But there was something else deep inside me, something now my father had never possessed. I had a flaw in my shield somewhere, a place where the iron melted if the flame got too hot, a thin spot, a weakness. I turned to my stomach, but I couldn't get rid of it. I never, ever had been able to. It was a fault I could feel, like an old wound, and right now it opened up inside me, just like when I'd thrown my arms around my mother, or when I'd almost collapsed in the bathroom after looking into the eyes of a girl I'd nearly killed. That weakness, like a cracked board in the middle of a bridge, always rattled and groaned at the most stunning and disarming moments. I could never remember where it was until half my weight stood on it, and it felt like it was about to break loose underneath me. That sensation made me sick now. My knees shook, and it only worsened the longer I stood here, because there was a trick to this gaping feeling. It had always been interrupted, whether by my father's scolding or the actions of another person. It had always been banished for me, allowing me to get cold and harden down again. I had never been forced to do something about it. I sucked in my breath, trying to get the gears of my mind to turn. This was stupidly simple. I could kick hay over Granger and leave her for dead. Or I could kneel down and feel her pulse. I didn't want to do either, but the weakness gaped again, and I realized that I couldn't just leave her here. I batted a tall stalk out of the way, thudded down onto my knees, and giving her the wickedest look I could muster, reached out my hand and pressed it to her jugular vein, just beneath her jaw. I jumped. A pulse had answered my touch. "Granger," I said, pulling my hand back to the rest on my knee. "Hey, wake up!" She didn't move. I glowered. "Granger, come off it!" I grabbed her shoulder and shook her. Still she didn't respond. I ground my teeth. "Fine." I braced my feet, grabbed both her wrists, and stood her up, jerking her hard into a standing position. Her eyes flew open. She gasped. I let go of her, startled. She staggered forward and caught herself. Her mouth fell open and her eyes darted around, but she didn't say anything. She just started gasping like a fish out of water, and then shivers took hold of her whole body and her teeth chattered together. "You look like you were dead," I cried. She wrapped her arms around herself. Her lips turned blue. She stared at me intensely with wide eyes as if she couldn't decide whether I was real or not. "I don't know what you were thinking of, trying to sleep out here," I shot at her, trying to hide the fact that my heart was hammering. "There's something off about this mist. Can't you tell? I wouldn't be surprised if it's bewitched with some sort of... What are you doing?" Granger stumbled toward me, not listening to a thing I said, and held out a shaking hand. I tried to take a step back, but my feet tangled up in the barley. Her palm met my shoulder. She gasped, and her eyes flew to mine. Her shaking fingers curled around a wrinkle in my shirt, and she stared straight into my eyes. For a long moment she searched me. Her expression broke. She sucked in a deep breath, and her frame loosened. "It's you," she rasped. I stood for a moment, stunned, and then cleared my throat. "Of course it's me." I knocked her hand away. "Know anyone else stuck in this godforsaken place?" Her eyes went dull, and her gaze drifted away. Her jaw clamped, and she wrapped her arms around herself. I swallowed. It didn't look like she was entirely awake yet. "Look," I said, "I'm not loitering about in this fog any longer than I have to. It's not got inside the willow yet. Are you coming with me?" She shivered once and didn't look at me. "Granger! Granger!" I snapped my fingers in front of her face. Her head jerked up, and she met my eyes again. She looked surprised. I heaved a sigh. "Completely blarmy," I muttered, then grabbed her elbow and hauled her back toward the way I thought I had come. The barley crashed all around us. She didn't say anything. She didn't shout at me for pulling too hard. She didn't resist. It was like she wasn't completely there. I winced, wishing I could hold my breath. If she'd gone mad breathing this stuff in, I wouldn't be too far behind if I didn't get back to that tree. "What's that?" Granger's voice had barely been a murmur, but I heard her. "What?" I barked. Then I glanced back at her. She was staring distantly off to our left. I stopped, and I followed the direction she looked. A soft glow waited in the fog. I swallowed. It couldn't be the willow, but it also could be another nightmare trying to suck us in. I looked at Granger and waited for her to say something definite. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she drifted sideways. I had to tug her to keep her upright. I huffed. She was going to be no help. "Come on," I muttered, dragging her in the direction of the glow. Even if it was another nightmare, the room might get rid of the fog to make way for it. In fact, it was a definite possibility, because I was almost certain that the willow was not that way. Well, almost certain. All right, I had no idea. The fog swirled around our ankles, and I secured my grip on Granger's arm. I couldn't have her stumbling off into the darkness. I would probably never find her again. "We're going up a hill," Granger murmured. "No, we're not," I answered. "The field is flat. And whatever this glow is, it can't be the tree, because the tree is—" I trailed off and slowed. The willow rose up out of the mist, and through the hanging branches I could see a soft blue light and sparkles of gold. Okay. Great. I pulled her forward, knocked the branches aside, and plunged us both back into the warm light and clear air. Granger sucked in a breath and pulled loose of me. I turned. Her eyes were suddenly bright, awake, and she was breathing hard again. Her brow twisted, and tears tumbled down her white cheeks. I stared at her. Her dark, shining eyes met mine. "How did I get here?" she asked, her voice trembling. I glanced around. "What do you mean?" I demanded. "We've been dragging through all that infernal fog for a quarter hour." She pressed her hand to her head, her mouth falling open as her eyes went wide and unfocused. I don't remember." She squeezed her eyes shut. "I fell asleep when the sun was going down, and I had a dream." Her voice lowered to a whisper. She flinched away. She opened her eyes, and more tears fell. "What did you expect?" I growled, throwing my hands out to the sides before turning and sitting down, leaning back against a root. "Sugar plums and fairies?" "I was trying to see how far the magic went," Granger whispered almost to herself. "Trying to figure out the rules, without going back into the forest." "You didn't seem to have a problem with going into the forest before," I muttered. "I wasn't going to leave you here," she burst out, as if I was being unreasonable. "Why not?" I wondered, confused. "Because we came in here together, and I have a feeling the room wants us to get out together," she rationalized, still not lifting her head. "But I wasn't going to drag you back in there so soon after—" She trailed off. I narrowed my eyes. "So soon after what?" I growled. She stepped closer to the tree trunk, turned around and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. Then she lifted her head and looked at me. My heart gave a deep thud, and venom filled my veins. "Why are you looking at me like that?" She blinked. "Like what?" I scowled at her, tilting my head back. "You think you feel sorry for me." Her expression flickered, but she didn't answer. I was right. I shook my head. "You saw me bleed a little, eh, Granger? Saw me lying on the floor crying to my mother, and you suddenly think you have a right to pity me." I spread my shoulders and lowered my chin, leveling a deadly look at her. She just stared back, stunned. I leaned forward just a bit and arched my eyebrow. "Let me tell you something, Granger. You think that because you saw some twisted version of my family that you understand something about me and my life. You know nothing. You understand nothing. You're just reacting like any girl would who sees blood splattered all over in front of her. The world's most venomous snake could be bleeding and thrashing around in front of you, and you'd feel sorry for it, without realizing that it could just get a little closer, it would kill you." The edge of my mouth curled. "You flatter yourself into thinking you're a compassionate person, so you think you ought to feel something when one of your classmates is being bled out onto the floorboards. But you don't care about me," I scoffed. "You've never given one thought about my happiness or well-being. Why should you? They're none of your blasted business. You hate me just as much as I hate you." I gave her a broad sneer, watched her face flush. "Admit it, Granger," I purred. "Tell me the truth. You think I'm evil, selfish pig, don't you? A stuck-up pureblood who you've loathed since you first met, and who you've been jealous of your entire life." "Jealous?" she yelped, her eyes flashing, her back going ramrod straight. "Jealous? Why would I be jealous of you? You're a stuck-up, arrogant, know-it-all show-off with a superiority complex. You're nasty and cruel, and you say wicked things, and you hate people without knowing them, and you judge people without taking 5 minutes to weigh the evidence. And besides all that, you're not half as clever and terrible as you think you are." "That's interesting," I replied, amused, "because if you ask me, that's exactly what I would say about you." She glared at me. "I do feel sorry for you." I lifted my eyebrows. "Oh, really?" "I do," she snapped. But it's not for the reason you think. It's because you're not strong enough to keep your character from being manipulated by your father. You have no idea who you are." I showed nothing on my face. The look I gave her was cold. "I have a proposal." I took a breath. "Let's stop pretending like we care about this comparison. Or even if the other lives or dies. I hate you, you know it. You hate me, I know it. So stop looking at me like I'm some poor dirty house elf you have to patronize and mind your own business." She went quiet, looking at me. I gazed back, refusing to flinch. Her brow furrowed. "Do you want me to hate you?" I frowned. All of a sudden, Granger looked tired, and her mouth tightened. "You're trying too hard," she said, and leaned back against the root and looked away. I folded my arms and glanced at the hanging branches. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no wind. "Do you have any pets, Malfoy?" I blinked. I looked at her sideways. She didn't repeat her question, and her eyelids were drooping shut. I leaned back. "Yes, I have pets," I bit out. "What kind?" "2 dogs," I sighed, irked. "And a cat." "What color?" I looked at her narrowly. "Gray." "Lives in the kitchen?" "My chambers," I said. "Why on earth do you care?" "There was a cat in my dream," she murmured. "A gray one, in your kitchen. You killed it." Part of me went cold. The rest of me brushed it off. "Don't be daft," I muttered. "I'd never kill a cat." "Why not?" I took a breath to tell her to shut up, but that weakness opened up in my chest again. I shifted, turning my shoulders away from her, tightening my arms around myself. I felt her looking at me again. I didn't return the eye contact. Soon, I heard her breathing evenly, and I knew she had fallen asleep. I was glad she hadn't pressed me into revealing the truth, that I was very fond of my little cat, that I'd raised him from a kitten, and hadn't told anyone at Hogwarts that I had him, that he'd been my constant, unobtrusive companion every summer and holiday for the past 10 years, that I had begun to worry each time I made the journey home that when I arrived I might find him buried in the garden. I clenched my teeth and glanced over at the sleeping girl across the way. Yes, it was another facet to my weakness, and I knew it. But Granger never would. Hermione. I lay there with my eyes closed, measuring my breathing, letting Malfoy think I was asleep. But there was no possible way I was going to allow myself to sleep. Not so soon. Not when tatters of my nightmare still hung in the corners of my mind. I tried not to think about it. I didn't want to slip back into it, but whenever I tried to pull up a more pleasant thought, images from my dream invaded it and turned it gray and cold. I had dreamed of Draco, but it wasn't him. Not the way I knew him. This Draco's presence filled the gloomy halls of Hogwarts, dark and terrible and sweeping. Everyone cowered away from him, except for his clouds of Slytherin followers. He was openly cruel, both with his words and his actions. He lashed out at younger students with brutal, sudden strength, throwing them into paving stones and sending them spilling into rows of desks. He laughed with real enjoyment when Quidditch opponents of Slytherin fell and broke arms or ankles. He openly defied the teachers, even Professor Snape. I saw him with his family. He was snappish and unkind to his mother, and he walked in step with his father. I watched him trip over a little gray cat in his kitchen, and promptly turn and kill it, and even leave it on the floor. He had white hair, a stunning pale countenance, and black eyes, black as midnight, without a ray of light within. Sometimes when he turned one way or the other, he almost looked like a young Lucius, and he was the bane of my existence. In my dream, this dark-eyed Draco pursued me every waking moment with relentless precision. He dogged me, sitting behind me in class so he could cut off the ends of my hair, walking behind me through the corridor and muttering foul things about my parentage and what bloody death I deserved. After years of it, of living with that oppressive intimidation factor every day, I stood up to him, in this dream, and he took me down. He did not hesitate. He did not waver. He bound me up with swift Petrificus totalis and flung me down into a black, earthy hole. Then, while giving me the wickedest and coldest look I had ever seen, he began to bury me alive. I knew I was going to die, that he was going to murder me, and I could not move. I could not fight it. I couldn't even scream for help. Then that dark form above me blurred, and it was replaced by a shining one, with eyes like blue stars. The newcomer grabbed my wrist and pulled me up and out of the open grave. The spell broke. I stared at my rescuer. He was clad in white, and looked just as pale as the one in my dream, but his eyes were unspeakably full of light. They were familiar. It was Draco, the Draco I knew. The Draco who stumbled through the masses in the halls just like everyone else, the one who generally avoided the first years and occasionally helped a young Slytherin find his way to potions class, the one who made a face when anyone got hurt in Quidditch, the one who sat in respectful silence during Snape's lectures, the one who looked away when Moody performed Avada Kedavra in class, the one who I'd seen hiding a laugh when Fred and George sent a firework dragon chasing after Umbridge. And even when I had finally awakened all the way, and he was taunting me with the full strength of his bitter sarcasm, I knew he was not that black-eyed Malfoy. He made me angry, yes, furious, but I wasn't afraid of him. He wanted me to hate him, but twice he had pulled me out of the most terrifying situations my mind could conjure, and he had apologized for calling me a mudblood. Why? But I could not puzzle it. My mind spun, all disorganized. My reason wasn't operating, and my heart still pounded too fast. I made myself settle, forced myself to relax into the soft grass and cool tree trunk. I listened to the silence, calming myself, counting my breaths. And that's when I heard someone outside call my name.